This episode is made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 118 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
This week, with the help of special guest Jessie Kwak, we discuss the second half of James S.A. Corey's 2011 sci-fi novel, Leviathan Wakes. We're delighted to welcome back our guest from last week. Jessie Kwak is the author of the supernatural thriller From Earth and Bone and the Durga System series of gangster sci-fi novels and the productivity guide From Chaos to Creativity. Welcome back, Jessie.
Thanks for having me.
Here we are again. All right, so I can't help but think about how this project, had we covered the book as we normally do, the book and then the show, how we would have just it would have been a disaster, because there's so much that happens in this. And I'm just guessing here, there's another season of television to be made just out of this half. I think season 2 is just going to be the adaptation of the rest of this.
Yeah, I feel similarly. I have heard that I think it goes up to about episode 5, so I think it's technically about half a season. I am curious though, because it feels like it could have been a full season. So I'm wondering how that's going to look. But yeah, it would have been an issue.
Yeah, that's my recollection of season 2, is that it takes about half of the season to finish up the rest of Leviathan Wakes.
There is an interesting decision there about what makes for a good kind of containment of a story, because you would think trying to have a story for a book and having a story for a season of television should be roughly approximate, but they made the decision to only go up to where they did in the show, and yet James S.A. Corey thought that they needed to go through all of that to tell a complete book. Do we feel like, now that we've read the full book, do we feel like the show left halfway through, or does it feel like the first season was kind of self-contained? I guess
for me, just thinking of it, if you I guess it's the same way with the show, but if you're writing a novel, and this is just speculation because I haven't, you guys are more
tell us about writing a novel, James.
Yeah, let me tell you something here. Let me book explain this to you real quick. I would assume that with a novel, you're going to want to tell the entire story that you have, whereas with a season of television, you can kind of hold out. I just think that they knew going into the show that they had the material for a season 2, and kind of felt that, because it didn't feel like we got half of a season in the show.
Yeah.
No, it did feel, it felt like a complete story ending on a cliffhanger that was obviously going to take you to the next part of that story. And they did, of course, bring some things that happened after the midpoint of Leviathan Wakes, earlier, when they go visit the Scopuli, and that takes place before they go to Eros in the show.
That's definitely true.
But it did feel like the book had a much stronger character arc, and it ended when the characters kind of had all completed their journeys in a way, whereas it felt like the series, it ended on a good stopping point that'll make you come back for season 2.
As a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How do you handle that in your series, Jessie? Just out of curiosity, do you feel like you like to stop on a cliffhanger in order to entice people on, or do you like to have completed arcs so that a book can be kind of self-contained?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the series that I'm working on now it's a 5-book arc, so that does make it a little tough where, right now I'm working on book 4, which is all lead up to the final battle of book 5. So it's kind of it's been hard to take these slices out and make them into individual books, because I am trying to make each one have its own arc. The first book in the series I tried to make as complete as possible, because I hate the experience of being brought into a series and being oh, now I have to go read the rest of it because they ended on a cliffhanger without resolving anything. So I made the first book very complete, with opening a can of worms that you'd be like, oh, I want to know what happens there. I will read the next book. I want to follow these characters on their next adventure. The second book is a little more cliffhangery. It's not terrible, but it's still like, all right, I really do want to read what happens in book 3. Book 3 is very much a cliffhanger ending, but I figured if you're that far, like, you're invested in the series. So I try to.
Well, book 1s it's kind of a different beast, right? When you're that first one, you're trying to hook people, but you're also, like you said, trying to give them something satisfying. Whereas, when you're in book 2, 3, 4, the rules are a little different there, I would imagine. So, I mean, and I'm sure this is something that you could track throughout this series. I haven't read more than the first book, so I can't comment on it, but I'd be curious if they always do this sort of like big arc that wraps at the end of the book, or if there starts to be more cliffhanger bringing you into the next. Because there are some cliffhangers here, don't get me wrong, but most of the characters' arcs sort of reach a terminus that you don't always see in a series.
Yeah, each of the books, as I recall, I've only read through book 4, but they feel very complete.
That's good.
And there's interesting stories that you want to follow to the next book. You want to know what the next bit of the mystery is, but it's not like they're leaving with somebody like with a gun to their head and they're like, and see you next book. You're like, what?
Right, yeah. There's cliffhangers that can be frustrating, and then there's some cliffhangers that I think, like, they're obviously cliffhangers, but it still feels fair to do.
Right.
Which I think that's kind of what the show did. It felt fair, even though it was a cliffhanger. To me, at least. I don't know. Reasonable people may disagree.
Yeah, I'm surprised at the scale that the book went for, and I think it was just the expectations that the show set up for me. And I should have known better, knowing that the book continues. Season 2 continues what the book had going on for the rest of it, and so, like, with the remaining chapter count or page count, I should have known there was going to be a lot more. But I was kind of surprised when we were kind of rehashing some of the things that they did in the show, like you talked about, Jesse, the scopuli stuff, and that stuff that they had already done, I guess, lulled me into a false sense of thinking that there wasn't going to be all that much story left, and then it just went bonkers, and it was really crazy.
Yeah, there's some big stuff that happens. Which, by the way, that's a good segue. We're gonna move through this thing through summarized paragraphs. I have 4 paragraphs of summary. We're not going to do chapter by chapter because that'll just take too long. But before we get into that, I have a few sort of general things I wanted to get out there. The first of which is I feel like I need to formally apologize for mispronouncing Amos's name. I got called out by a friend of mine, Curtis Chen, who mentioned that if I watched the show, they pronounce it as Amos. And I watched the show, yet in that episode, I still called him Amos.
I think I called him Amos as well. Yeah.
I think we both did. I can't remember. Like, it's weird. I can't even remember if, like, Jesse, I don't know if you called him Amos or Amos. I don't even remember.
Well, and I was there last night when we had this conversation with Curtis, and I have a cousin named Amos, and so that's how I pronounce it. That's how I've always pronounced it. But my husband, for some reason, always pronounces Amos as Amos as well. And so I remember listening to your episode and both of you pronouncing it Amos and me being like, oh, why do some people do that?
Right. But, yeah. I mean, it's like people who say Hermione or whatever, right? Yeah. I think it's like once you read a word, you just decide in your head how you're going to say that word.
That was my defense.
Well, and I wonder, like, so Amos is also a book of the Bible, and so that's, I have a cousin named Amos, grew up in a church, and so, like, it's a very common word for me growing up to hear.
Right. Whereas, and he mentioned famous Amos cookies.
Oh yeah, the famous Amos cookies.
Which I should have thought of. I didn't realize they were spelled that way, but yeah, I should have thought of that. Anyway, kind of not that important, but in case it's been grating on it, I'm sure it's been grating on other people. Yeah. I'm going to do my best. Amos is how I will try and pronounce it from now on. The other thing, I wanted to give an update on where I'm at with Naomi and Holden. Nice. Because I felt like that was kind of what we ended the last episode on. And now, granted that I still believe that book and show are very different, and I hold out hope that maybe I'll like it more in the show. But I don't really like where this goes in the book. It just it never feels right for me. It's okay. Like, I don't hate it. But it feels reductive to me for her character. And we'll get into it with some of the summary and stuff. But just in general, I am not as big a fan of this romance. And not liking it in the book also makes me kind of not want it to happen in the show, even though like now I think it's going to happen. So I don't know. I feel like I'm still kind of undecided, but the show has pushed me more in your guys' direction.
She's just like she's a different character in the book too. I mean, they all are. It was actually stopping in the middle and then going and watching the show and coming back and reading the rest of the book. I was like, oh right, yeah, they all are kind of cardboard, all the secondary characters. It really drove that home. But there's a scene where like bullets are flying around and she's like lying on the ground with her hands over her head and she's refused to carry a gun in the book, and you're like, Naomi of the TV series does not refuse to carry a gun. She's not lying on the ground with her hands over her head. So I guess I was a little bit more forgiving of it in the book, just because I was like, maybe she's she's not too cool for Holden in the book, I guess.
I see. Like the character isn't as badass in the book, so therefore it's fine.
I mean, there was the scene that happened in the book where she says like, I was pretty excited because I thought what was happening was she was gonna like turn him down because of the fact that he was like a player and he was like having sex with all these people on the station and all this stuff, and she's like, you don't actually love me, it's just that I'm the only girl left. And I was like, oh cool, this is like a interesting dynamic that we're gonna get here. And then it just like pretend that conversation never happened, and like a couple
later on she kind of acts like that was an invitation, like you heard me say that when you're gonna make your move, and I was like, oh well.
I was like, oh man.
She was like, well, don't tell me that you love me to get me into bed with you, I will go into bed with you. You're like, okay, but
yeah,
you kind of did make a big deal about that. So
yeah, I also wanted to get in, I meant to say it in our original book coverage and I forgot, so I wanted to make sure to mention it here. James S.A. Corey, the pen name that Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank use, they chose because they thought it would evoke the space opera writers of old. I guess they had names similar to this. So the name comes from their middle names. So it's their two middle names, and then it's the first initials of, I believe it's Daniel Abraham's daughter. Yes. So that's how they came up with this name. I don't know. I thought that was kind of fun. That was how they pulled it. James, if we were to co-author a space opera, what would our James S.A. Corey name be then? We don't have a daughter we could pull from, but
yeah.
Let's think about it. My middle name's Paul, so it'd be Paul. And then let's go with, I have two dogs, Nymeria and Tyrion. So let's go NT. So Paul NT. What's your middle name?
My middle name is David.
David. Paul NT David? Doesn't have the same ring to it.
No.
Paul David's pretty good though. Just the N
Paul
and
David?
T in there kind
not bad.
Don't work
Yeah,
the same
maybe
way
the
as
NT
SA.
are the wrong way to go.
Paul David sounds like the whitest white guy ever.
Yeah.
Paul David.
Well, I mean, so does James Corey.
Yeah. And James Bailey for that reason.
Jessie, you want to disclose your middle name?
Lee.
Lee.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's Leigh.
Lee David. Anyway, I just thought it'd be fun to kind of play around with that, but that's all I have. I think I'm ready to get into the summary. Do you guys have any other general stuff before we move into that?
Oh, I actually have an answer for something you asked me last week, since we were just talking about Naomi and Holden. You asked who I would shape Naomi.
Wait. You're going to refer to something we talked about in a last episode? We rarely do that.
Are we fact checking here?
No, please do.
Not fact checking, but just I realized I didn't actually answer this. But you asked who I would ship Naomi with, and there's a woman who shows up, an OPA woman who shows up in season 2, played by an actress, Cara G. Her name's Kamina Drummer, and I think she and Naomi would be real great together. But alas, spoiler alert, it is just my imaginary ship.
Damn.
We had a character, I believe, named Sammy show up briefly in the book.
Oh, yeah.
Who was like a woman mechanic.
I had hopes for her too, but...
Yeah, I was like, oh, is this going to be a recurring character? And it seemed like they had some chemistry, so I was kind of wondering if they were... And that was before I think the thing really took off with Holden, so I was still holding out hopes, but they didn't do any of that, and they just went with what kind of the expected route, I guess.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read some summary here, and we can kind of react to it and move through it in chunks. All right, so last we left them, we were in the middle of chaos breaking out on Eros. I think they had just been irradiated, Holden and Miller. So Holden and Miller realized that the people in the shelters were infected with the same organism as Julie, and the radiation is being used to feed rapid growth. They witnessed the infected attacking security forces and spreading the infection to anyone who had been able to avoid the radiation chambers. They escape Eros just as it is being overrun. Fred Johnson contacts Holden and tells him that the analysis of a data chip belonging to one of the dead Marines from the Donager reveals that the mysterious stealth ships were built on Luna. Holden makes another public broadcast, sharing this information, hoping to ease the tensions created by his prior implicating of the MCRN. This strategy backfires, however, and the UN, fearing that they will be blamed for the attack on the Donager, launch a preemptive strike against the MCRN by destroying Deimos, I believe is how you say that, site of a Martian military installation. Okay, so let's stop there. That's a pretty good chunk.
It's
what
actually
did we think
pronounced
of
Deimos. I'm kidding.
Deimos? Is it?
Deimos.
No, I'm just kidding.
Okay. I'm burned now. Like, I'm the paranoid. I'm mispronouncing everything. It is probably, Deimos. Deimos Amos. Anyway, what did we think of book version of this part of the story, and then moving into this kind of reveal of the attack from Earth and the UN against Mars?
I know it's talked about, but Holden is really really quick to jump on that comms system. Like, he's like, as soon as he gets information, it's going out there. And I know they talk about how, like, you know, it's better to have it out there because then it's like getting the secrets that people are trying to keep out there, and it kind of ruins their plans. But ultimately, like you're putting everybody on edge, and like this is why attacks are happening. And like he's kind of playing into I think we learned he's kind of playing into the fact that it's all a big distraction.
Well, it kind of reminds me of just like Twitter, right? Like something happens and now everyone's like freaking out on Twitter. And I kind of wonder,
tweet about it immediately.
Yeah, like don't react, or like don't think about it, just put it out there. And then what people see, right, is this like spike of like paranoia that happens at the initial thing, and not the like rational, reasonable response that happens later. And so that's always I'm just like, oh, Holden, like, think about it first before you just put it on Twitter. But he just goes for it.
Think before you tweet, guys. Come on. I love that. I love we see Miller column on it here, which I really liked. You know, we're kind of moving past the station stuff, but it's pretty similar to what goes down on the show, which we already talked about. Right. But yeah, when Miller really calls him on it and says, like, think about what you just did and how that's going to, you know, what kind of effect that's going to have. And then even he immediately shows that, like, Earth basically immediately launches a preemptive strike and people are dying. And it's interesting that Holden's reaction is actually pretty, I don't know. I thought he really kind of deflects blame from himself. He's like, oh, I was just sharing the truth. I didn't make them do that, kind of thing. I don't know. It's kind of weird. And I think it's like the two different characters butting up against each other, like we talked about, like the different version of Holden this is versus what we get in the show. Yeah. Because the show version of Holden feels a lot more emotional, and I would have thought that he'd have a bigger reaction to all these people dying because of something he said. Whereas book Holden is a little quicker to just kind of say, like, well, it's their decision. I didn't make them do that. Right.
I think he is being rational in the way that it's, you know, like, ultimately it is just getting information out there. He's being very, like, utilitarian, I guess. He's very much like, it needs to be out there. If people die, they die. You know, like, this is what it is. Like, people need to know the information. But
it's similar to the Kant message. So remember the Kant message, right? Where we talked about his motivations seem different in the book versus the show. And in the book, it was very much like, this is the information people deserve to know. And he just sent it. And he didn't really think about, like, how it was going to be interpreted. It didn't matter. He just wanted to get the information out there, and he does the same thing here.
Yeah, he has in the book a very, like, right versus wrong sort of character backbone. I mean, like, Amos calls him righteous at one point, and they then go on to talk about that quite a bit, like how he picks the path that he believes is right, and then sticks very strongly to it and is very convicted to that path. Whether or not that is the correct path or the smart path, I feel like the book is trying to get us to believe that he is on, like, the righteous path, and the things that he is choosing are for him black and white, and so he's not necessarily seeing the consequences as consequences of his actions because he has to do this thing that he sees as right. For me, the word righteous, I mean, I already mentioned growing up in a church, but it has good connotations, but there's also that, like, it makes me shy away if somebody is described as righteous or describes themselves as righteous, and it's a red flag for me.
Yeah, it can be like, it could be judgmental.
It
could be, they could be wrong. You can be righteous about something you're wrong about, which is never a good combination.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
To me, it seems like if someone is overly righteous, they could be so passionate about it that they could be like blinded by this sort of like righteous path that they have, like kind of in the same line of what you guys are saying.
Right. Well, or the sort of inflexibility of that, right? Like inability to see nuance, inability to make compromise. If you're righteous, you're sort of very hard line. I think is kind of what you're getting at, and that can sometimes be an issue. Yeah. And that's, that does seem to fit this version of Holden pretty well. So I kind of agree with that assessment.
I wanted to ask you about the fact that the UN launches a preemptive strike. And also, to put it into context, something that I don't know that I really understood as much until later in the book was it was the UN and the Martian forces they're supposed to be coexisting and ruling over all of this area together. Like, I kind of thought of them as separate forces that were always against each other, like sort of like leaning on each other for vying for power or resources or whatever. But it's very ultimately, like, from what I'm understanding, it's more of a civil war than any sort of like war on two different sides.
I think it seemed to me a bit more like a Cold War than a partnership. I guess that's the impression that I had of like Earth and Mars.
Yeah, like there's tensions have been building, which we hear about, and we know that Earth had been running simulations, and it seems like they're frightened of Mars because Mars has the superior naval force, and so they had run these simulations where they said if we're going to have any chance if Mars attacks is to get a preemptive strike in before they can muster their full power against us. And as soon as this message goes out, they say, okay, it's time. It's go time. We got to do this thing. And so they launch that preemptive strike. And yeah, I mean, obviously they're all humans and they all, Mars, all the people on Mars came from Earth originally, but, or their ancestors did. But yeah, I mean, it's like it is kind of a civil war if you look at it that way, because you also have this protomolecule, which we see as kind of an alien threat coming out now. So speaking of that, I think let's get into the next bit of summary. So Miller and crew follow the coordinates from Julie's phone and find one of the stealth ships called the Anubis abandoned. In the reactor room, they find that the same organic growth that was on Julie Mao's body has consumed the entire remaining crew of the Anubis and Scopuli, whom they had taken prisoner. They find a video explaining that the organism is a biological replication mechanism created by extrasolar aliens and placed on Phoebe, which was then launched into the solar system with the intent of reaching Earth and hijacking its early biosphere in order to create something, but was captured by Saturn's orbit, thus sparing Earth. Protogen, the corporation who had discovered the entity on Phoebe and dubbed it the protomolecule, orchestrated its release on Eros as an experiment to try and find out what it was designed to do. They had carried out a false flag attack on the Cant in order to start a war that would distract the solar system from what was happening on Eros. The Rossi crew nuke the Anubis and return to Tycho Station, where they discover the data is being transmitted from Eros to a secret Protogen facility. They attack the station with Rossi and destroy 2 stealth ships guarding it, and Miller and Fred leading a boarding party consisting of Fred's OPA soldiers who are able to capture it. So a good bit there, covering all the stuff on the ship, finding out about the protomolecule, and then leading to them taking this station and killing some of these ships. Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty good chunk. What do you guys think of this part?
As I was listening to your summary of it, I love the idea that they picked Phoebe as like the missile that was launched into our solar system, because my nieces and nephew have this like solar system memory game with all the pictures of the planets, and like they're all like these beautiful smooth round planets and moons, and then there's Phoebe, which is this like weird little potato shaped thing. You're just like, where did that one come from? So anyways, I just thought that was fun.
That's cool.
Yeah, that is fun.
I loved a lot of this stuff with we talked about like threads that clearly they told a complete story, but there are threads that are lingering, I think, here. And this sort of idea that aliens had plans to change the human race at an early time, and then this sort of trap that they lay, or this weapon was captured by Saturn. Like, all this stuff is just so fascinating to me. I thought it was all really cool.
Yeah, and this is our first time we've been told essentially that this is aliens, which up till now we haven't really known. It's been a mysterious thing, but I assume everybody suspects it's some sort of alien thing. But there's also a potential that it's a human developed bioweapon, so we hadn't confirmed it. So does that change this story for you in any fundamental ways, or did it feel like it was all within the realm of the world they had established?
I mean, I think it has to change your feelings on the story fundamentally, just because like it totally changes the playing field, knowing that there's something else out there and they're a threat. But ultimately, like, I think it's in fitting with the story. I kind of always assumed there was some alien stuff going on here.
Yeah, I agree. I think there was always in the back of my mind as I'm trying to remember the first time I read this as opposed to the reread, but there was always in the back of your mind like, okay, what is this weird thing? It's already starting to do, crazy stuff. Like, is it some bioweapon that somebody's made? Is it something from outside our solar system? So I think it wasn't necessarily a surprise for me reading that the first time, but it was like, oh, okay, but why? It just feels like this whole section is like, wait, but why? But why that? Exactly. But why that? Okay, we have an answer, but why that?
Yeah. It's a pretty intricate plot, because we have the idea is that Protogen destroyed the Cant for the express purpose of being a false flag attack to fuel this war, to be a distraction from them studying era. Like, it's a pretty convoluted plot, but I think it all holds up. I mean, this is something that impresses me, because this is a very hard thing to do in a book, like have all these moving pieces and then have them all line up in a way that is believable. Because I don't know about you, but whenever I start going through my plot, I'll always start to go like, is this even remotely believable, or does this fall apart? And it can be hard sometimes to judge your own plot in that way, so I'm sure you have to run it by people. But I don't know, I was impressed with this because it's pretty intricate.
Yeah, totally. I mean, although it does feel so, my husband is the one that reads my books as a beta reader and pokes holes in my plot, and so he's always like, so this is a really cool action sequence that you've got here, and this is awesome that this thing's happening, but like, does that really make sense? And I'm like, well, I'm trying to justify it, and he's like, okay, but it doesn't, because why would they have done this really complicated thing and why wouldn't they have just done this really straightforward thing? And I'm like, because it makes a better story. And I do
never
remember,
a good answer.
Yeah, but I do remember when we were both reading Leviathan Wakes, he's like, so I'm like, don't poke holes in this. It's already done, and I'm enjoying it right now.
You can't turn it off.
You can't turn it off. It's always like, why did they do this stupid, complicated thing instead of just like not
doing something simple?
Because it's a better story. Yeah. Turn your brain off and enjoy the story. Anyways, my books are better for it, but
you only have to get like a certain way there. Like, you don't have to get 100%. Like, exploring, you don't have to explain every alternative they considered and why they chose not to go down those routes, because that is boring and no one wants to read that. But if you propose something that's plausible enough, that's like, okay, they landed on this as their decision, then I think most readers and most viewers or whatever will forgive you and go with it. But
right.
That's going to vary from person to person.
And it's fast-paced enough and interesting enough that you don't look behind the scenes too much, It's when you start finding yourself being like, now why did they do that? Because they could have done this, then you're bored, and that's not a good story. So I feel like they passed that test of like, I didn't stop and think why this very much.
Yeah. You guys are making me, like, an extreme example of this to me is like if you're watching a really schlocky, like, bad horror film, and like, the characters do something that's just like completely implausible just for the moment that's going to come when the murderer comes around the corner and like just murders somebody in some incredible way that everyone's really shocked by and everything. It just makes me think of something like that doesn't service the plot really as much as it does, deliver some spectacle.
Right, which is, I mean, that's the viewer experience too, right? Like the viewer or the reader experience. Like, I mean, there's part of it that I think if the story is good and you're enjoying the experience of reading or watching this thing, like, it doesn't really matter if the plot doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right. Yeah.
And not saying that this plot doesn't make a lot of sense, but in a general term.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true, but yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think this does hold up pretty well. Now, I just finished reading it today, so I haven't really gotten a chance to like fully digest and think about all the nuances. Maybe there are other things that would have made more sense, but it seems plausible enough to me where I was willing to just go with it. And then honestly, it was just more of like a professional admiration of like, this is a tough thing to pull off, and I think they pull it off well here, so kudos.
Now, I don't know about you guys, but just knowing from our coverage that this, they sort of started to realize that they had a story to tell while crafting a tabletop game of some kind. How much of that were you thinking about during the reading? Because I found myself thinking about it a lot in terms of things that were happening. I was like, so like, was this still a holdover from the game, or was this something that they crafted after the fact? I don't know. I just kept thinking like where they came up with certain things and what would fit in a game.
Oh, your ship blew up. Now you have to go visit Tycho.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. It's hard to differentiate. There are definitely a few things where I remember thinking like, this is not something that would ever happen in a tabletop game. You know what I mean? Like every now and then a moment like that would happen, but then there's a lot of stuff that totally would, so it's kind of hard to say. But speaking of kind of the fun action sequences that maybe or maybe not could come out of an tabletop, the attack on the station I thought was really fun, right? We get Rosie doing some cool maneuvers, pulling high G's, and it happens a lot in this book, but it's always fun when it does, and they're drugging themselves to stay awake, and we get a lot of discussions of like eyeballs changing shape and like all this stuff that'll happen to you at high G's, right? Like, and it'll give you a stroke and like all this stuff. It's bad. And then the Rosie gets shot to shit, but they are able to kill, to destroy. I keep using kill because that's what they say in the book. But it's funny because I wrote down, like, I thought it was kind of weird that they always say that. And that they should be saying, like, destroy, because it feels weird to say, like, you kill a ship.
I feel like with a naval battle, you would say kill as well, right?
Do you?
I think.
I always feel like you say you sink them, right? Like,
I guess.
You didn't say, like, the Titanic was killed when it ran into a...
No, I think
what
specifically in battles, though. I think, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I thought that it was some sort of like...
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that iceberg killed the hell out of the Titanic.
I mean, it makes sense, and I see what they're going for, but I would be curious if anyone is like in the Navy who listens to write in and let us know. Like, does that seem weird to refer to like you kill a submarine or you kill a ship in combat, or would you say you destroyed them or you sank them or some other term?
Yeah, I'm sure.
I'd be curious to know.
I don't know. I'm sure. I feel like it's more informal, but I think it has something to do, and this is just speculation again, but you name a ship has a name, and it's like it seems like people refer to it in like more of like a personified way than just a thing that they're floating on. So I don't know, maybe it has something to do with that.
No, I think you're right, and for the most part it worked. There was, I think, the one moment where it seemed weird to me was when he was describing all of the ships getting shot down over Mars, and he literally said like all these ships getting killed, and it just felt weird that it was like it was focusing on the ships. Yeah. And not the people. Right. And then I think after that he says, and the people on board, but like just that first sentence of like all these ships getting killed, I'm like, what? So it's just felt like kind of a bizarre way to describe it.
When you say it now, it kind of sounds like an 8-year-old just saying it, right? And then the ship got killed.
So, it sounds a little weird. Now, granted, these guys aren't military, so maybe although one of them is former military, or maybe more than one of them, but still, it I don't know, it's a little odd. Anyway. Total tangent we're going on there. What were we talking about? Oh, the attack. So, what did you guys think of that whole the scene, the shootout?
I really enjoyed the whole action sequence there, and I thought was a really good example of another thing that I really admire about their storytelling, which is the going back and forth between Miller and Holden chapter by chapter, and weaving this story even when they're going kind of in different directions, even when they're coming together. And always making it work to tell like this part from Holden's point of view, this part from Miller's. And in this section, of course, Holden's up on the Rosie and they're off shooting stuff and having big high G maneuvers. And then Miller's with the crew that's actually like attacking the station. And so you're getting to see both sides of this battle. So I thought they did a really good job of using those two narrative points of view against each other and to give you a bigger story just throughout the book. Like that's a hard thing to do too.
Oh, absolutely.
This is kind of off topic a little bit, but I wanted to ask you guys based on like something about this story, the way that it's told in comparison to the show. And I think it's because a lot of the, like, Jessie, like you talked about, a lot of the characters, the secondary characters are more cardboard. A lot of this story, because it's so Miller and Holden centric, it was making me think about how much I'm looking forward to seeing these characters go through some of these events, and having the full cast of characters kind of reacting to a lot of this stuff. Do you know what I mean? So like this kind of feels like and it's probably going to sound bad, but it kind of feels like we're getting like plot points in anticipation of seeing like the characters go through it. And we do get it, but I feel like it's very much like more Miller and Holden that we're getting the viewpoint of.
So you're looking forward to watching the show and getting to see what all the other characters experience?
Yes.
Yeah. No, totally. I completely understand that.
It's interesting because this is the first book in this series, and they only have 2 POVs other than your prologue and your epilogue, right? And I know this isn't a debut novel for them, although under this pen name it is their first. So I don't know, maybe some of the rules still apply. But I often get this advice when you talk to authors, and they'll say, try and keep your number of POV characters down in the first book you write. That's a trap a lot of writers fall into is having 7 or 8 POV characters in their debut, or trying to have that many in their debut novel, and it's just very hard to manage. But it's a long book, and so at times it does feel a little claustrophobic almost to have only these 2 POVs. And I didn't really think about this at the time, but now that we're talking about it, like it can feel a little contrived that they are getting either Miller or Holden involved in every major event, or both, throughout this entire series. And it's a bunch of major events, and they're always involved. One of them's like on the ground, or one of them's in the ship. And when you only have 2 POV characters, that's your only option. So you're kind of forcing yourself into that mold. So I'm just curious, do you remember how many POVs this widens out to, like even roughly?
I don't remember specifically, but I would say probably between 3 and 5 per book for the next ones.
Like 3 and 5, and then they hold at that throughout, or does it continue to add?
I think they hold at that throughout. I think for the next books, they'll add like characters that are really only in that book.
Well, you said like Christian Avasarela, or I'm sure I'm butchering that one.
100%. I've been butchering that one since day one.
Are they a POV character in next book?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, well, there you go. So that's at least another one. Interesting. Anyway, so again, kind of a tangent. I did want to mention here, there was a moment that I really liked where, and I thought it was just going to be kind of a cute moment, honestly, to kind of reduce it. But it actually does come back and actually be really important later. Holden essentially tells Miller, like comes up to Miller and he's like, hey, where are we going to meet up after this is over? Because I got to make sure all my crew are like, get out of this alive, because I don't trust everybody. And Miller realizes that he's being considered one of the crew here, and then he has this like feeling in his chest, and then he walks away and he like actually tears up and cries.
Yeah, that was kind of charming.
And that was a really touching moment.
Yeah.
And then we know that it comes back here in this next section, which we can get to. And if you guys are ready, I'll read the summary, but then we can touch up on how their relationship changes. So, the lead scientist, Anthony Dresden, reveals that all of the scientists on the station had been, quote, modified to remove ethical restraints so that they could emotionlessly perform their research without empathy for the victims on Eros. He emphasizes the importance of understanding the protomolecule not only for its innate scientific value, but to protect against the clear threat presented by the aliens who created it. Realizing that Dresden's rationale is likely to be accepted by the powers that be on Earth and Mars, and his research will be allowed to continue, Miller shoots Dresden without warning, angering Holden. Quote, he was going to get away with it, Miller explains. So, that's perfectly setting up what we're about to talk about. This changes their relationship going forward, but also a pretty dramatic moment. What did you think of this moment? What did you think of Dresden and his sort of spiel he gives?
It's a very James Bond villain sort of spiel, that like, this is why we did it, and this is why you should all be on my side. And I think they get away with that by just showing how arrogant he is and how he does actually believe in his mission. I'm so curious about how the scientists were modified. Like, I don't know, that just such a crazy thing to me. Like, and such a surreal, like, horrible thing to think about, like a bunch of people who have probably consensually, I don't know, said, yeah, fuck with my brain so that I can kill people without remorse.
Yeah. And they talked about it earlier as well, right? They said like, oh, how could they ever have this group of people that would go along with all this stuff? And then, we come to find out that they're modified. Pretty crazy to think of technology getting that far, or I guess medicine.
So I have a couple thoughts about this. One, I think it's possible to do this. I know that there are parts of the brain that when get damaged, people do lose empathy and they lose their ability to like feel certain emotions and stuff like that. So I think it's possible that they could do this. But on the other hand, I don't know that it is actually necessary, because if you look at human history, we've seen that people are fully capable of this sort of shit without being modified. Now, maybe there's some selection that goes into picking them, right? Or self-selection of the kind of people who volunteer for this sort of work. But you have to look no farther than Nazi Germany to see plenty of scientists who were doing horrific things, and they weren't modified. You know what I mean? They didn't have their brains tampered with. They just did that because there are evil people out there, and there are people out there who can think of other people as lesser enough to where they don't feel empathy for them. And we've already established that a lot of people from Earth feel that way about Belters. So I actually don't know that it was necessary to go down this route. Yeah. And in fact, it kind of took away a lot of the blame, because it's like, oh, well, they weren't in their right mind, so you can't really blame them. And it kind of put all the blame on this one guy, which was kind of convenient, and a little Bond villainy, like you said.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it that way, but that is way more horrifying.
Yeah, and maybe they just didn't want to go down that route. I don't know. But it is also kind of fun to think of this guy like going in and altering all of their brains just to get them to do this thing. But it does make him kind of the figurehead and the ultimate person responsible, so that when he gets shot by Miller, we are all cheering Miller on. So much so that honestly, because of all this, it made me really kind of like, I don't know, I disagreed with how Holden handled all this. Because I felt like he was being way over the top about like, oh, I can't trust you anymore. I can't trust you around my friends. I don't know who you're gonna kill next. I don't know how. It's like, come on, dude. Did you hear this guy's speech? Like, it was mustache swirling, Bond villain. It was very, very bad, and it was clear that people were starting to go, oh, maybe not. I don't know. Like, I felt like he was being kind of a jerk to Miller over this. And it felt kind of unwarranted to me. But I am curious to know what you guys think. Like, do you agree that this was him sort of showing that he's unstable in a way?
No, I think this is going back to the Holden righteousness thing. I mean, and I think it's after this that Miller and Amos have that conversation where Amos talks about Holden being righteous. And I think as the reader, like, you are on Miller's side. I mean, you're in his head when he does it, and it makes sense. You're already empathetic to this situation. And so I was definitely with you thinking that Holden's way overreacting, but it also seems very much in character. And I think this is maybe a moment that's supposed to be that final wedge that says, okay, this is the kind of guy that Miller is versus the kind of guy that Holden is. And this is what, like, Holden will never be able to cross that kind of line. And two, I think something you said in the last episode about, where is that character arc going to go with Holden? Where will this, how will he have to bend? How will, where is the breaking point of this, like, righteous backbone or whatever? Like, I think that's kind of what they're setting up. I mean, just from reading this book narratively. But.
Yeah. Just in terms of what we've talked about, this sort of moment that the author is hoping that you go along with, I think that this very much represents that. And we get this sort of, and it's very clearly to set up this moment that's coming up with Miller and kind of like how the characters align nearing the end of the story and how everybody ends up. But yeah, I think in terms of a couple of things that I wanted to talk about, the Dresden stuff, I think that you're right, Luke, with the sort of like because even in his rationale, he had this moment where he was talking about like, it's not even about all the experimenting that we can do on it in general. It's also like we need to find out what the aliens are capable of. And I could see people going along with that, you know, like knowing like, oh, we need to know, we need to understand, we need to reverse engineer, we need to create weapons of our own based on this and that kind of thing. And I think he could have had people behind him, like you said, without modifying anybody. And then, yeah, I think ultimately I understood like why Holden did this. It totally fit with his character. I agree with you guys.
Yeah, well, and so we should say what he does. Essentially, he uninvites him from the crew. You're no longer part of my crew. You're not going to be around the people I love, and he kind of sends him on his way, which really hurts him. And after we saw that moment where he cried because he had someone accept him for the first time, but he kind of knew this was going to happen too. It was just sad, and like I felt really bad for Miller here, and I think we're supposed to.
Well, especially because then he goes off to like bunking with Diogo.
Yeah,
we haven't talked about that yet, but that's one of my favorite like minor character relationships.
Oh yeah, that was fun. I agree. All right, so let's get into this final chunk. This is big. It's gonna contain everything that happens through the end of the book, and then we can kind of just react to the rest of it. So back on Tycho, Miller and Fred Johnson come up with the plan to attack Eros to prevent anyone else from trying to obtain a sample of the protomolecule. They intend to commandeer Tycho's main project, the massive Mormon generation ship, the Nauvoo, and crash it into Eros at the correct speed and angle to propel it into the sun. Miller leads a team onto the exterior of Eros to plant bombs and detonate its ports, so that no one can get in and sample the protomolecule before it is destroyed. He then decides to stay behind and die when they go off. Just before the Nauvoo impacts the station, the trajectory of Eros is inexplicably altered. Eros then sets out to Earth, the largest source of biomass in the solar system, at a speed that no human-made ship can match. Miller takes one of the bombs into the station to attempt to destroy its maneuvering capabilities. However, listening to the voices on the communication system, he realizes that Eros is being guided by Julie Mao, who believes she is racing. He finds her infected body is the host of the parasitic relationship with the protomolecule. He is able to convince her to direct Eros away from Earth. The station crashes into the surface of Venus, where the protomolecule begins assembling a new unknown structure. And that's where we leave the end of the book. So, where do we want to jump in on this? A lot happens here.
I mean, this is what I meant about this story going bonkers, because I was, you know, because of the show, I was of the assumption that Julie Mao was not showing up in any sort of capacity. Right. Or I guess her body would show up, which it kind of does, only her body show up, but she actually shows up because she's like speaking and thinks she's doing something else.
It's like her essence or her personality.
She's still in there,
soul
kind of.
Almost. Yeah.
But yeah, it's crazy. Like the Mormon generation ship gets brought in and like they crash it, and like the bombs that they.
But they don't crash it; it misses and it just goes off into space. I guess I don't know what happens to that thing.
Right. Wait, doesn't it? They wanted to hit Eros with it and shoot it into the sun.
Yeah, that was the plan, but
right.
Eros jumps out of the way, and so
Eros dodges.
Yeah, then the Nauvoo is just like flung out
somewhere else. Yeah.
So crazy.
Who knows?
So hitting Eros and flinging it into the sun. That sounds so plausible.
Right.
Yeah, it seemed very elaborate, but okay. So maybe this is starting to stretch a little bit, but I don't know. Maybe there's not a better way to do it. At the very least, they've established the Nauvoo has got very powerful thrusters attached to it, right? Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what they're using it as. Just like it's going to push. Because there's nobody on it.
And obviously the oh shit moment of it dodging is showing us like no matter what kind of capability technologically we have in this world or this universe, it's nothing on this alien tech that they have or whatever sort of bio weapon they have here, because it's like faster, and like they talk about how like it has like a crazy way that it travels or something like that.
Well, yeah, Miller's inside of it, and he's like, it still has the spin gravity from Eros, but it doesn't have the gravity of whatever crazy speed that it's traveling at. Like, other ships can't even keep up with that without actually killing their crews, because it's just going so fast, and Miller's just like, oh, it feels like normal.
Right. Mm-hmm. Really interesting.
Yeah, which was bizarre. I kept thinking that was going to be some sort of reveal, and in fact, I thought we were going to get the revelation that that it actually hadn't moved and that it was like casting an image or something, and that's why the gravity hadn't affected him. But instead, it just didn't affect him, and we don't know why it didn't.
Well, I think
it figured out a way to do it, I guess.
I think it's, and I meant to mention this earlier, but like the idea of having the aliens introduced, but having them looming is, I think, obviously, I think you have to like build that up for a little while. And I'm glad that we don't just see aliens in this first book. And like, if you build to it, I think just having that threat looming is cool. But in setting up their technology and the fact that like they can travel at speeds that we can't, and like they're not dealing with any sort of inertia or whatever it is, it's just like they're like that threat becomes so much more dangerous, I think, because we just like they could show up at any time and then they would just completely outclass anything we have and just devastate us.
Yeah, I think there's a line in there something about like these aliens were already demigods when humans were still like trying to figure out protozoa, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like we were
right.
still like thinking photosynthesis was a big deal.
Yeah. Right. Gotcha. So I thought a couple of things I have to mention here. One is, I think we talked about Dead Space, but it's very Dead Space. It's also sort of like The Thing, another project we covered.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I love this kind of alien. It's an idea of it's unknowable. It's this substance that mimics the things it attaches to. So in that sense, you can get away with a lot because any sort of humanity, any sort of human thought or motivations that you're detecting are sort of being absorbed by the things that it's mimicking. Mm. And so you can kind of play fast and loose with it in a way that I think is really fun. And then I love the idea because I think I might have mentioned in the last episode that I was like, I wonder if it's going to take over Eros and then we're going to have Eros being kind of controlled by this thing. And that's exactly what happens here. Which also made me think of The Fifth Element. Do you remember the weird planet that's like coming at Earth that they're trying to stop, and it's got some sort of intelligence and they're talking to it and stuff?
Yeah.
I kept thinking of that here, which I thought was pretty fun.
Well, because then it's like they're listening to the feed of it and listening to it as, basically as whatever the protomolecule is trying to figure out how humans communicate, and it's just like recycling words and languages and playing with sound. And one of the things that I really loved was how the like young belters were remixing it with music and like making
that was funny
music like EDM for their dance clubs and stuff like that. And Miller, like I mentioned his friendship with this kid Diogo, and like they're basically sharing a bed, and like one goes off to a shift and the other one sleeps, and Miller the whole time is just like, kids these days. And I loved that little relationship where Diogo's like, hey, have you listened to this? And Miller's just like, what are you guys doing? You guys are so strange. This is fascinating. So I loved kind of his old man looking at the kids these days friendship with Diogo.
Yeah. Well, and that all serves a narrative purpose too, because it's all making Miller focus on the sounds and the transmissions that are coming off of Eros. And I sort of knew intuitively that something's there. It's like either it's going to, I thought that eventually it was going to start, like they were going to write it off as nonsense, and then it was going to start making sense at a certain point. What I didn't see coming was that it was going to be the thing that breaks the whole thing open and is proof that Julie Mao is still sentient within there somehow. And I love the way it kind of goes back and says like, oh, when it was mentioning this and that, it was all clues that it was actually Julie. So I thought that was a really clever reveal in a book that's had a bunch of these sort of reveals already, and then to have another big one here at the end, I thought it was really fun. I really liked that. I
had honestly forgot that was like how they solved the problem of it. And so when he was like, oh, I'm listening to Julie's voice, I was like, oh, right. He now has to go like reason with the alien who's still possessing. I forgot about that.
Mm-hmm. It is crazy that he's able to like convince her, right? Because her humanity is still there enough, I guess.
So I was also thinking about how you, James, I think you said like, I think this guy's gonna die. It might have been like 2 episodes ago or whatever, but you were, or maybe even just the end of the book episode. So I was like, I thought you were 100% right, and you kind of are, because I think he dies. I don't know. If Julie was still alive though, then he could still be too, because we know he gets sort of, the protomolecule gets into him.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting that I feel like both of us were kind of right, because I had said I thought they were like going to do something new with him and take him in a new direction. And they kind of do too, because he even says at one point that he feels like he's taken up her mission, and now he is doing things he would have never done, but he knows she would have done it, so he's going to take up that mantle. So he does that, and then he sort of has this tragic potential death that happens at the end of the book.
Yeah. I would say that like he probably died, but I'm not convinced that this is the last time we see Miller in some way. I'm sure he shows back up. But yeah, I just thought when I said it, it was more specifically about like where the character was at and not necessarily the situation. Because I thought that they were setting him up to like, because he was like dying of cancer or something, or dying of radiation.
Right. Well, the radiation.
So he, I don't know, totally different scenario, but I guess technically similar outcome.
But he was on a death wish path, like when you said that.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, he obviously still was. Like that's why he stayed on Eros, is to die.
Yeah, he just stays there to die. Yeah,
right.
And it's sad because we know that like part of that is like Holden kicking him off the crew and making him feel like he has nobody left.
Right.
So
that was another thing like that. Yeah. You know, I had already said how low I felt like he was, and it's just like blow after blow for this guy. He's just having a rough go of it, and then ultimately like that's why we don't just like turn our nose up at the fact that like, oh, he stays on the ship. Of course he stays on the ship, because this is what's going to happen.
So a couple other things to talk about. One of them, we got to touch back in on the Holden Naomi relationship. I just wanted to point out there's a couple of like kind of weird semi-gross moments that happen. Where Amos figures out that they're together, and then I can't remember if it's here or some other point, he says something like, she's like my sister, but I'd do her if she'd let me. And I thought that was a really weird thing to say.
Oh man, coming back to Cardboard Amos was the worst. Like the rest of them were just like, okay, but after the series Amos, coming back to the book Amos was just like, oh my god.
Oh my god. I totally agree. Like he's a shadow of the version we get on the show.
Oh yeah. And
it's sad to see. Yeah. I don't know. I wonder if I hope that they develop this character more throughout the books, because I don't know. He seems so much less interesting than book version, than show version.
Again, I'm really fascinated to just think about the process of these writers, because they've gotten to the point where they got to have a second go of it. They got to have they got to do a redo for some of these characters in like these situations. So it's really interesting to think like, is that them? You know, is that the influence of a writer's room with them? Is that because clearly they're not like, they are influential for the show, but they're not running the show. So you would assume that there's some sort of input from other people, or is this them basically saying like, this is what we would have liked to have done now, you know, actually doing a redo, getting her.
Yeah, maybe. And then we also, there's a moment where Holden makes Naomi angry, and then he has this thought where he's like, oh, she's so cute when she's angry. And it's like, it's so condescending and like gross, and I don't know, it really made me hate the relationship, because you wouldn't have that thought if you hadn't just slept with her. And I don't know, I thought that was bad. I did not like that at all.
I think Holden would have had that thought anyways, because he kind of already did have that like relationship with women. I don't know, like, I mean, it really doesn't seem like they'd be together unless she wasn't the only person on the ship, the only woman on the ship rather.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, I don't need to keep harping on it, but yeah, a couple of those things just made it worse. It was like, I already wasn't a big fan, but then whenever that would happen, I'm like, oh man, I really don't like it.
I kept thinking about how you were a supporter in the show, and I was just like, he's gonna regret that.
It's this what happens when you come in and you start making bold statements halfway through a book or halfway through a show, right? Like it's gonna come back to bite you sometimes. Like, I love this character who ends up being a huge asshole, like next episode or next part of the book. It happens.
So let's talk about this Venus situation, right? That's just
okay. Well, before let me back up a little bit, because that's kind of the end here. But before that, I wanted to talk about this other Earth ship that is present, that Holden is having communications with the captain, and they're like threatening each other, and they're like almost open fire on each other, and we see a lot of restraint out of Holden here. And I thought this was kind of a good moment for him, showing once again like why I respect him as a captain in the book a lot. And I think it's kind of a good moment where it's like everybody else would have said like, kill them now, but instead he keeps holding off to like the last second, and finally they decide not to shoot each other. and sort of work together, I guess.
It's interesting that
So-
the guy who gets on the comms immediately shows restraint in like a combat situation, though.
Well, we also see a moment where Fred calls and asks Holden to essentially sacrifice himself and his crew to try and keep up with Eros. And I thought it was an interesting character moment for Holden to not take that chance and decide to just power down and say, it's not worth it to me to sacrifice the crew and a chance, even if that results in Earth getting destroyed.
I'm curious.
This is a big decision.
Do you guys think he would have made an opposite decision if he was alone? Like if it was just him and Fred had asked him to do that?
Yeah, I think so.
I think probably, yes.
I think it's the crew, really. He's so biased to this crew, and you know, if there was a little bit more to some of these characters, I feel like I would buy it a little more. But he clearly cares about this crew more than anybody else in the universe. It seems like.
Yeah, and it's kind of the anti-utilitarian view, right? Like if the scientist is very utilitarian, like, oh, what is 1.5 million deaths compared to the entire, you know, all of humanity throughout the solar system? You know, it's a drop in the bucket. It's worth it to get to the bottom of this alien threat. Whereas Holden's saying, like, I'm not willing to sacrifice these 4 people because I care about them too much, even if it means the entire Earth.
Not just the entire Earth, but like literally he's imagining his family being consumed.
Right.
Yeah. And he's got a big family too.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, and it's good to point out that it wasn't a sure thing. And he even realizes, like, it's probably not even going to work. Like, we're assuming that it can't go past a certain speed and it won't be able to outrun us anyway.
Right.
So
probably if he knew that it was going to work, he would have, like, run
if it was
it by
100%
the crew or something, you know.
Yeah.
But risking them on a chance, that it did seem in character.
And then we get this call from Miller where he says, so I figured out that Julie's still alive and she's in here and she's controlling this thing and I'm going to go talk to her. And he's got this like bomb he's been lugging around with him on a like a trailer, or like a what is that?
I thought it was like a shopping cart. Yeah.
Yeah. He's pushing it around. I don't know. It's really fun to think about them going through. And he's going through this like hellscape of like a Dead Space level. Like there's just growth everywhere. All the bodies have transformed. We keep getting them describing like a rib cage with an arm dragging itself around is something that they see a lot.
Or they saw once and just have to keep describing to us, I think, is what it was.
You see that kind of thing one time and you're gonna keep mentioning it, I think.
Remember the arm?
And it just kept me thinking of how, like, in the book, this is way more horrific and sort of like horror movie feels to it. Although they do talk about like blue fireflies and a blue glow. But I was thinking about how the show turned that way more sort of blue sci-fi, right? And less horror as starkly, it seemed like to me. You know, very crystal-y and less... it's still gross, don't get me wrong, but I don't know. This is not the same as brown goo and sort of the viscera and the stuff that they talk about a lot here. Mm-hmm. It's just very grimy.
Well, because then Miller's like... He calls and he says, I need more time, I need to find Julie. And Holden's like, you've got 37 hours. And Miller's like, I need more time than that. And you're like, how much time do you need? And so then they have like 3 chapters worth of diverting the missiles and then like posturing with the other Earth ship, and Miller's going through room after room. And I was like, couldn't we have just kept that 37-hour timer and forced Miller to come to the conclusion he eventually comes to and find Julie, like, you know, with 5 minutes left or something like that. But it's like, instead they give him unlimited time and take away that time bomb threat, which I thought was a really interesting choice. Because that's what you know, at the end of a book like this, you're like, here's my ticking time bomb. You have 37 hours. And they're like, oh, you have unlimited time. Don't worry about it. Oh.
Right, that's a lot of time. I think that's probably has to do with like cosmic scale, right? Like it's probably some sort of like they were doing calculations and they were realizing no matter how fast this thing's going, if it's coming from here to Earth, it's going to take time. It's going to take... Yeah.
But it was just like, how much longer does this book need to be? Like, you have a ticking time bomb.
Right. Fair point. In fact, I didn't remember that was the time frame, but I believe you. It sounds right. But yeah, because there is some time that goes by here. And I kept thinking, like, it's going to take him a while to traverse this whole station and find this one room where Julie is. Which he does, by the way, and we should talk about, like, this really sort of bizarre tableau of Julie, but like her hair is like crystals and it's turned into this bed that she's laying on, and he compares her to like a mermaid, and he comes up to her and he talks to her, and she's surprisingly cogent, I would say, and able to sort of have this conversation pretty, I mean, she's a little out of it, obviously, but she's not like screaming in horror or anything. She like kind of is able to have a conversation with him. And I did think it was a touching moment. It was Miller's arc coming full circle, right? Like coming to its terminus. He has found her at last. He saves the world, literally, through what he does. But it's on a very personal level, too, because this is the woman that he has sort of decided he wanted to try and save. And this is his chance to try and do something like that. And he kind of goes down with her, too.
Like, she's kind of become his patron saint at this point, I think.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. And so he takes his helmet off and he breathes in the protomolecule, which probably smart if you want to have any chance of surviving this. And it's also like he's kind of like joining her in this. I don't know. And then they divert and they go to Venus instead, which I think, James, you were going to say something about before I rudely interrupted you.
No, it was just that's like the cliffhanger. I wouldn't even call it a cliffhanger, but that's the thread that's left, right? That's like the biggest one, I would say, is like sort of like, oh, Venus is actively assembling a structure that's like slowly becoming bigger over time. And like, we don't really know what this protomolecule is fully capable of. So I'm sure that is not just there by coincidence. What do you think? Do you think it reaches out far enough? Do you think it continues to build this like crazy tower that reaches to another planet or something? Or what happens
No,
here?
so I think, and I'm going to speculate here, and I know, Jesse, you probably know the answer to a lot of this, so sorry that we're speculating on something you can't really comment on. But it feels to me like this alien presence now has a home world in the solar system. Yeah. And it's going to start building structures. It's going to start forming into something. Now, is it going to reach out to, via some sort of communications, to the actual aliens who sent it originally and bring them into this solar system? Or is it going to be driven by Julie and possibly Miller? Are they going to be continuing to be sort of sentience involved in the protomolecule planet? I don't know. I'm really fascinated by this. I like the idea of it building structures on Venus and sort of like everyone's arguing about like, what do we do now while it's sitting there, claiming an entire planet for itself? And it's clearly going to be a threat going forward that they're going to have to deal with. So I think this is almost not even a cliffhanger, although it functions in that way. This is the kind of thing that, like, if you're going to have a series, you have to do this. There has to be something that is like demanding the reader to come back. And this feels very fair. It had its own thing, and it was part of the climax and it got dealt with, yet now it's changing. It's like shifting into another phase. And the promise of the next book is that it's going to address that. And that's what I think makes people want to read book 2. It works for me.
It doesn't really fit exactly, but it kind of makes me think of Stranger Things, the end of season 1, where Will like coughs up that slug thing after everything's resolved and everything's happened. He like coughs up this slug, and you're like, oh, there's still something. It's it's not over
Spoiler
yet.
for Stranger Things.
I'm assuming everyone in the
most
world
people have
seen
probably seen it by now.
Season 1, like I think people have seen it.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, Jesse?
I think it's a very good series, book 1, in that it does, the world has been saved, the 2 main characters, their arcs have been more or less completed, they've both come to some sort of, self-realization, you feel really good about the story, but holy shit, what's going on? I need to know what happens next. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a pretty classic way of ending a book 1 if you want to have a series that's successful.
Yeah, what more could you want?
Which, I don't know, their series might be successful. Time will tell, I guess.
Yeah, it's doing all right. So I just want to take this moment to like think about our experience of the book and the show, what we've covered here, where this sits in the pantheon of sci-fi for us, and I don't know, just kind of reflecting on this coverage, because we've spent James and I have spent 4 episodes, 2 with Jesse, talking about this, and I think it'd be nice to kind of sum it up here and give our final thoughts on it before we put a bow on this thing.
Oh, that's a big question. So where does it fit in the pantheon of science fiction, and what has the experience been?
Sure. I mean, I threw a couple of things at you. Whatever you want to react to.
I think I was struck by what you said about them choosing their pen name to kind of harken back to this classic sci-fi era of these like, big stories about small people doing like impressive things. And I think that they told that story really well. I enjoyed the hell out of it. I enjoyed the hell out of both the book and the series. And I already mentioned a little bit, like reading and watching them so close together gave me a very different perspective on both, which was really fun. I have enjoyed this trip back through these properties that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, that's the thing that we do all the time, and we do really enjoy it, reading and watching things very close together gives sort of a unique perspective on them that you don't get otherwise. And it's something that we found rewarding, I know, throughout all of the things that we've covered on this podcast. Definitely true here.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you, Jesse, for kind of being our guide through this. That you already are familiar with this stuff. So thanks for bearing with our speculation and like giving input where we needed it. Like Amos, from now on we'll always know Amos.
Well, we got to thank Curtis for that. Yeah, Curtis called us on it. But yeah, it's that's a mistake that hopefully we've remedied this time by getting it right. But James, I'm not letting you out of the question, man. I want to know your take on it.
Yeah, I'm ready for it. So so in terms of, I like what Jessie was saying with sort of the fact that she liked the way that they chose their pen name, because I do feel like this is such a, in terms of like a pantheon of sci-fi, I don't put it towards the top, but I do really enjoy it because I think it does what other ones that I do put up in the pantheon, I think it does what those things, it cherry picks the things from those greats, and I think it uses it in very effective ways. So I think it's like it's this great sort of sci-fi story that's referential, but also doing things that are new, and it feels familiar but also fresh. And so I would just say it's really a serviceable show. I really enjoyed it, and I like the books as well. If you need any sort of thoughts on where I'm at with it, like I'm going to continue watching the show, and honestly I'll probably read the books as well.
Yeah. That's close to where I'm at too. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think this is a better show than I kind of thought it was going to be. I think this is one of those rare occasions where I lean more towards the show as far as like what I'm enjoying, even though the show is far from perfect. But I do really enjoy the books as well. It's close. And I think from just the whole thing, if you look at it all as one sort of canon, one thing, the world, and when I say the world, I know it's more than one world literally, but the world building that is done here still is the standout thing for me. And I can see how this is a property or an IP that people want to be in. You know what I mean? Jesse, we went to Worldcon, I think 2 years ago, and we went to an Expanse party. And it was funny because I felt like kind of an imposter because I'd never read it or seen the show.
Yeah, it was like a Belter bar.
It was a Belter bar at Worldcon. People had like Remember the Camp. There was like a big banner up on the wall. And I'm sure there was other references that I didn't get.
And they were speaking like in the Belter patois, and they had all these different like fancy cocktails they were making.
That sounds awesome.
Exactly.
That's cool.
It was really neat.
Yeah, and I remember thinking like, wow, people really care about this, and they really are getting into this, and I can see why. You know what I mean? And that's the thing that strikes me from this, and I think is a lesson for anybody who's trying to write stuff like this, is to make your world rich enough and deep enough that people can get invested in it like this, because that's the ultimate sort of fan experience when people want to be a part of it. And that's something that it seems like it's achieved for me, and just from what I've seen, from Worldcon and other things like that. So yeah, I'm good. It's good stuff. I've really enjoyed it, and hopefully our listeners have liked coming along the journey, and liked hearing us mispronounce names left and right, all of the above. If you want more of that, stay tuned, because I'm sure I will do it again. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Jesse. Share again with listeners, in case they happen to only check out the book episode or what have you, where they can find you online and where they can find your books.
Yeah, so you can find me at jessiekwak.com. That's JESSIEKWAK. And that's kind of my hub for everything. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram. You can find those links through that website.
All right, so we're gonna let you go. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been super fun.
Thanks, Jesse.
So, what's next for Ink to Film? We are going to be doing our Christmas project, and we talked about it, and we decided we want to get into the weird and wonderful world of Dr. Seuss. We're going to be covering How the Grinch Stole Christmas.
Yeah, I've heard some weird stuff about Dr. Seuss, so maybe we'll talk about that on the book episode.
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to be researching this guy. I'm going to see what I can find out. I'm sure it's going to be interesting. And we're also going to be covering the film, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which was a 2000 film featuring Jim Carrey. We put a poll up on the Council of Inklings on Facebook, and that was what the overwhelming choice was for what people seem to want to revisit. I think that's the favorite version of this. Yeah. So that's the one we're going to be covering.
I got to say, I'm not surprised. I'm not really surprised at all. This and you know, I have an interesting history with this movie. Like it hit me at the perfect time when I was a kid. So
okay.
I've
never seen
it. Came out.
So
oh, you haven't?
Yeah, I think I've walked in a room and like seen it on, but I've never watched it. So I'm excited to try it.
I'm going to predict that you enjoy it more than you think that you will. That's what
I like
that's
Jim
prediction.
Carrey, so I wouldn't be surprised if I do.
That guy's a performer. That guy is unbelievable. So.
He is. You know, I think Ace Ventura. You know, when you see that and you're like, well, how are you going to like this guy? He's clearly this. Like,
90s comedy movies probably don't hold up to the comedy that we're putting out today in films necessarily, but I mean it had its time. So
yeah, but then you see stuff like The Truman Show, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Like you see some range from this guy. I think he's a good actor, and even as just a comedic actor, he's really talented. So absolutely, we're getting into it. Liar, liar, stuff like that. He's a fun guy to talk about. So I think it'll be the first time we've covered anything Jim Carrey related. So maybe we can talk about him a little bit more. The only other episode we have coming out this year is our Last Looks 2019. I can't believe we're going to be doing our third Last Looks episode. It's crazy.
It's weird. It's crazy.
Isn't that wild?
It just doesn't feel like that much time has passed. But at the same time, I look back at our catalog and I'm like, damn.
Yeah.
3 years.
118 episodes. We'll be looking back at all of the stuff that we covered this year in that episode. And we'll be talking about it, kind of revisiting favorites, highlights, lowlights of the year. It's usually kind of a low key episode. So pay attention for that. That'll be coming out towards the very end of the month. And that'll be it for us in 2019. We'll probably take a week or two off in 2020. Oh my God, I can't believe it's gonna be 2020. And then we'll be back, picking things up again. So we hope you join us for sort of our end of the year episodes we have coming up here, because I think they're gonna be fun.
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned what the 2020 is coming up, and the movie that we're covering coming up came out in 2000. And when I think of 2000, I think like, oh, that was like what, 7 or 8 years ago. But no, 20 years ago.
Just a few years ago. Yeah, that's wild. 20 years. Oh, boy. Anyway, yeah, we're getting old. Such is life. Anyway, this was a lot of fun. We thank you for joining us for our Expanse coverage. We also wanted to thank our patron, Ben E., for supporting the show for a long time. We know he's a fan of the Expanse. We hope he enjoyed this coverage. If you wanted to find out how to become a patron yourself, go to patreon.com/inktofilm. Find out what kind of stuff we're offering. Your monetary support helps keep this show going, helps keep us covering things week to week, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you to Ben. Connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. And on Facebook, join the Council of Inklings. We post polls, we post news, we post all kinds of stuff in there.
Like
so
our
make
Christmas
sure you
poll.
check it out. Yeah, our Christmas poll was in there as well. So check that out.
Absolutely. And if you would like to help out the podcast in another way, it doesn't cost you any money at all. Leave us a rating and review on whatever platform you're on, whether that's Apple Podcasts, or if you just want to go onto Facebook, you can rate our podcast on there. There's lots of ways to do it. The main thing is that you post something online about the show, because that helps us get the word out, helps us get new listeners, which is the biggest hurdle for a podcast our size, is to just get people to know about us. So anything you can do to help us in that, to that endeavor is greatly appreciated.
Thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music, and thank you to Jennifer Delazana for providing our transcripts.
All right, so I'm excited for these final 2 episodes of the year. It's going to be a nice, cozy holiday coming up. Hopefully everyone is enjoying theirs, and we will see you next week. But until next time,
thanks for listening.